Hello, my name is Rebecca Treiman, and I'm a professor at Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. Well, mastering any complex skill, whether it's playing the piano or riding a bike or cooking a gourmet meal, requires integrating a number of basic skills, and writing is no exception to that. It's learned and perfected gradually over a period of many years. And spelling is one of the components that goes into writing. If you're accurate and fluent at spelling the individual words, you can concentrate on the higher level aspects of writing. But if you have difficulty with spelling, that's going to hold you back as a writer. Particularly in languages like English and Portuguese, learning to spell is complicated. It's a long process. We've conducted a number of research studies to see how this takes place, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some of the findings and discuss their implications with you. Well, children in modern societies are surrounded by print. For example, they see labels on food packages, they see writing on t-shirts. And so all of these experiences allow children to begin to learn some things about writing from an early age before they've received formal education. And they can learn, for example, about what writing typically looks like. Let's take a look at this slide here. This production was created by a 2.5-year-old child. Does any part of this resemble writing? Well, you see the part with small squiggles in the bottom left, the child identified that part as writing. Now there's no letters present, but that portion is small and dense, much like written words. So suggests that even young children might recognize that writing looks different from pictures. And we've done some research studies to test that hypothesis, and they do support the observation that from an early age, children are beginning to learn about the visual characteristics of writing. If you take a look at this slide here, these productions were made by a 2-year-old child who was in one of our research studies. In these studies, we asked children to draw pictures and to write the corresponding words. So the picture on the left side is the child's drawing of the sun, and the one on the right is their writing of the word sun. Well, neither one of them contains letters, neither one of them looks very much like the sun, but you can see that the one on the left is more like drawing, and the one on the right looks more like writing. And indeed, in these studies, we found that preschool children who are asked to write a word make smaller scribbles than those who are asked to draw pictures. Also, when writing words, children are more likely to choose a pen or a pencil than a crayon. So these findings suggest that children have some knowledge about at least the visual appearance of writing before they've gotten formal education. Yeah, so if children develop expectations about the appearance of written language, then those expectations may lead children from different countries to produce uh, basic writing that resembles the writing of their native language. And indeed, we found results like that in a study that we did with 2 to 5-year-old children from the United States and China. So in this study, we had children from both countries write words in their language. And we asked adults who knew both Chinese and English to judge whether each sample was made by an American child or a Chinese child. So if you take a look at this slide here, it shows some samples from an American child and a Chinese child who are writing the word sun in English and Chinese, respectively. And the bilingual adults in the study could determine the native language of the writers, not perfectly, but better than you would expect by chance. So even when children aren't using recognizable symbols from their writing system, their productions have some of the typical character writing in their language. And so the message here for teachers is that there is more to children's early scribbling than we often think. Teachers can look at it closely and they can know that the characteristics of a young child's scribbling can shed light on the early steps that the child is taking in learning about writing. Preschool children do have phonemic representations that they use in speaking and listening. For example, children who speak English can distinguish between the words bat and pet, words that differ from another in just one from another in just a single phoneme. Young children can say the word bat in a way that sounds different from the word pet. These are things that children do unconsciously without thinking about it. Bringing these phonemic representations into consciousness, as in deliberately breaking up a word into phonemes, that's something that's more difficult. And that's what children need for spelling and for sounding out written words. It's difficult for many children. As a result, we see children who use recognizable letters when asked to write words, but letters that don't reflect the phonemes in the words. So the message here for teachers is that children need guidance in thinking about the sounds in words and learning that writing represents those sounds. In Brazil and some other countries, it's widely believed that literacy learning occurs in stages. The first stage is thought to be one where children don't understand that writing represents language. But even at this stage, children are thought to hold some hypotheses about writing. For example, the hypothesis that written words should have a minimum of at least 3 letters. During a second stage, according to this theory, children take writing to represent the level of syllables. So, for example, they believe that a word with 4 syllables should be written with 4 letters. In reading, likewise, it's thought that children would use as many syllables in pronouncing a word as letters. So this is called the syllabic stage, according to this theory. And then the most advanced stage is thought to be the alphabetic stage. So we and others have tested this theory in our work. We've done some work with Brazilian children in collaboration with Claudia Cardoso Martins and others. And we find that Brazilian children do not generally go through a syllabic stage. Yes, many preschoolers do produce some spellings of words where the number of letters is the same as the number of syllables, but that's going to occur sometimes just by chance, that there's going to be the same number of letters as syllables. So we compare how often children do that to how often it would be expected to occur by chance. And we find that most children don't produce more spellings with the same number of letters as syllables than you'd expect by chance. When such spellings do occur, they seem to reflect partially successful attempts to represent phonemes rather than attempts to represent syllables. So we need to be cautious of theories such as the theory about a syllabic stage, which have been supported largely by informal observations. And I should note that it's a normal part of science that theories will be proposed, then they'll be tested, and testing may reveal that some predictions of a theory are not upheld. The theory then needs to be changed. So that's what's happened with theories about a syllabic stage. So the message for teachers is that grasping the idea that writing represents language at the level of phonemes and learning about how it does so is critical in learning to read and spell. This is not generally preceded by a stage during which children take writing to represent the level of syllables. Instruction can begin by focusing on units of sounds that are larger than individual phonemes. For example, words that rhyme usually share more than one phoneme, and so rhyming is one of the easier phonological awareness tasks for children. Once children can succeed with larger phonological units, such as rhymes and syllables, then they can move to single phonemes. To make instruction more engaging for children, teachers can focus on words that are particularly important for them. So, for example, they could use the names of children in a class when teaching phonemic awareness, like that Maria and Murguela both have names that start with the phoneme. Phonemic awareness is important, and teaching phonemic awareness can help children move into phonological writing. But we need to keep in mind that phonemic awareness is a means toward an end. The goal of a typical classroom teacher is to develop readers and spellers, not poets. So we should be teaching phonemic awareness as a bridge to reading and spelling. It's not worth teaching highly complex phonemic awareness tasks that aren't going to help kids with reading and spelling. That time could be better spent on teaching reading and spelling itself. Children do learn some things on our own. I talked earlier, for example, about how preschool children pick up some of the visual differences between writing and drawing, and they do that without explicit teaching. But we can't expect children to quickly and easily pick up everything that they're going to need to know about reading and spelling on their own. Children do need explicit instruction. And that's particularly important for complex writing systems, where there is sometimes more than one way to pronounce a letter or more than one way to spell a sound. And indeed, many studies show that children do better in spelling and in reading when they're given explicit instruction in phonics than when they're left to discover things on their own. Explicit instructions help teachers as well as children, and that's because teachers who understand the processes involved in learning to read and spell can provide better support for children. So take a look at this slide that shows a U.S. child's attempt to write the word triangle. Now, some people would look at this and say, why did the child use CHR at the beginning? That is totally wrong. But if you've had some training about language, you would know that the first sound of triangle, as pronounced in English, is similar to the sound that is typically spelled with CH, as in cherry. Triangle, it's like a ch sound. So a teacher who knows that would realize that the child has listened to the word carefully and has tried to spell the sounds. Now that's an example from English, but there are a lot of similar cases in Portuguese. And the idea is that teachers can learn about language, use their understanding of language and the writing system to make sense of why children made particular spelling errors or particular reading errors. Well, by participating in this course, you're expanding your knowledge about reading and writing development. You're learning about research that has been done and about its implications for teaching. And that's going to be beneficial for your students. I congratulate you for your efforts, and I hope that you will seek out additional opportunities for learning. Thanks for having me.